I sat in that leather chair in Mr. Henderson's office, my hands folded tight in my lap, and watched my nephew Michael stand up, clear his throat like he was about to give a speech at church, and say the words that would crack something deep inside me. The family agrees, Grandma's getting nothing from the inheritance. It should go through the proper line through our parents. Since she never had kids, she has no claim. The room went very still. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the lawyer's desk, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my heart kept beating when it felt like it had just stopped. Let me tell you something, honey. I'm 73 years old now, and I've lived through wars and recessions, through the loss of my parents and my only brother, through lonely Christmases and quiet birthdays. But nothing prepared me for the moment when the children I'd helped raise, the babies I'd rocked and fed and loved like my own, looked at me across that polished mahogany table and agreed I deserved nothing. Not one of them spoke up. Not Michael's sister Sarah, who I'd sewn a wedding dress for when she couldn't afford one. Not their younger brother Tommy, who lived with me for 2 years when he was struggling with his demons and needed a safe place to land. They all just sat there, some nodding slightly, some looking down at their hands, but none, not a single one, said a word in my defense. I want to take you back to the beginning, though, because this story didn't start in that lawyer's office. It started 60 years ago when I was a young girl of 13, and my baby brother James came into the world screaming and red-faced and needing someone to love him fiercely. Mama had a hard time with the birth, and Papa worked long hours at the mill, so I became James's second mother in a way. I fed him his bottles, changed his diapers, walked him to sleep when he had colic. When he got older and scraped his knees or got in fights at school, he came to me first, not Mama. I never minded. I loved that little boy with everything in me. I never married. That's something people always want to know about, like there's something wrong with a woman who doesn't walk down an aisle in white. Truth is, I had chances. There was Robert Miller, who worked at the hardware store and brought me flowers every Saturday for 6 months. There was David Chun, who taught at the high school and asked me to dinner so many times I lost count. But by the time I was of marrying age, Mama's health was failing and Papa needed help keeping the house. And James, well, James had just gotten married himself to a woman named Patricia who made it clear she didn't have time for in-laws or small-town life. Someone needed to stay and take care of our parents. Someone needed to keep the home fires burning. So I stayed. Papa died first, on a cold February morning when the frost was still thick on the windows. His heart just gave out while he was sitting in his favorite chair, the newspaper folded in his lap. Mama followed 6 months later, and I've always believed it was grief more than the cancer that took her. They'd been married 47 years, and she simply didn't want to live in a world without him. I understood that. I held her hand while she slipped away, and the last thing she said to me was, "Take care of the house, sweetheart. Take care of our memories." The house. Let me tell you about this house because it's important to understand what it meant. Papa built it himself, board by board, nail by nail, starting the year he and Mama got married. It wasn't much at first, just 2 rooms and an outhouse, but over the years he added on whenever he saved enough money. A kitchen, a second bedroom for me, a bathroom when indoor plumbing finally came to our road, a front porch where Mama planted roses and we'd sit on summer evenings, snapping green beans and watching the lightning bugs come out. Every corner of this place holds a memory. The scuff mark on the kitchen floor where James dragged his toy truck. The height marks on the doorframe where Papa measured us every birthday. The crack in the living room window from the baseball I hit when I was 9, which Papa never fixed because he said it reminded him I had a good swing. When Mama and Papa passed, they left everything to me. Not split between James and me, just to me. The house, the 3 acres of land it sits on, and the small savings account they'd built up over decades of careful living. The lawyer explained it to me privately, just the 2 of us in this very same office where I'd sit decades later and feel my heart break. Papa had updated the will 2 years before he died, and he'd been very specific. He told Mr. Henderson, this was the senior Mr. Henderson, the father of the man who would later read James's will, that he wanted me to have it all because I was the one who'd stayed, who'd sacrificed, who'd given up my own chances at a different life to take care of them. He said James had made his choices, moved to the city, built his own life, and that was fine and good. But this house, this piece of earth, this was for me. I never told James the full truth of that. When we met after Mama's funeral to go through the papers, I just said Mama and Papa left the house to me and offered him half of the savings. He waved it off, said he didn't need it, He was doing fine with his accounting job and Patricia's teaching salary. He said I should keep it, live comfortable, maybe fix the roof that was starting to leak. He seemed relieved, actually, that he didn't have to worry about the old place or figure out what to do with it. Patricia made a comment. I remember this so clearly, she said. Well, at least someone gets some use out of it. Like the house was a burden she was glad to avoid. So I stayed. I patched the roof myself, taught myself from a library book. I kept Mama's garden going, planted new roses when the old ones died, added vegetables in the back 40. I painted the porch every 3 years, replaced the steps when they rotted, updated the wiring when it started to spark. I made this house not just a memory but a living, breathing home. And when James and Patricia's children came along, Michael first, then Sarah 2 years later, then Tommy after another 3, I became the grandmother they needed because Patricia's mother had passed young and Patricia herself wasn't much for nurturing. I kept those babies when Patricia went back to work. Michael was 6 weeks old when she dropped him at my door with a diaper bag and a tight smile. I rocked him, sang to him, taught him his colors and his letters. When Sarah came, I had 2 little ones underfoot, and I loved every chaotic minute. I sewed their clothes because store-bought was expensive. I baked their birthday cakes from scratch. When Tommy arrived and Patricia was overwhelmed with 3 under 7, I took all 3 of them every weekend so she could rest. I taught them to fish in the creek, to make mud pies, to pick berries without getting torn up by thorns. Summer after summer, they were more mine than anyone's. James and Patricia were busy people. Modern people, they called themselves. They had careers and evening meetings and weekend seminars. They had a nice house in a subdivision 40 minutes away, with central air and a 2-car garage. They'd drive out to drop the kids with me and barely stay for coffee. We've got to run, got a thing, Patricia would say, already backing toward the car. Thanks so much, you're a lifesaver. And they'd be gone, dust kicking up from the gravel drive. I didn't mind, or I told myself I didn't. I had the children, and that filled up the empty places in my life. I had the house and the garden and the quiet rhythm of seasons. I had my church on Sundays, my library books, my quilting circle on Tuesday afternoons. It was a small life maybe, but it was mine and it felt full enough. The children grew up the way children do. Michael went to college, got a degree in business, married a woman named Jennifer who wore expensive perfume and talked about property values. Sarah went to nursing school, married young, had 2 babies before she was 25. Tommy struggled more. Dropped out of college, bounced between jobs, had some trouble with drinking that nobody wanted to talk about directly. When he was 26 and hit bottom, it was me he called at 2 in the morning, crying and scared. It was me who drove to the city, picked him up from a situation I still don't fully understand, and brought him home. He lived with me for 2 years while he got sober, found his footing, learned a trade as an electrician. He slept in his daddy's old room, and some mornings I'd make him breakfast and it was like having James young again, all that possibility still ahead. James got sick 5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and mean. Patricia called me from the hospital, her voice thin and strange. I drove straight there, sat with my brother while he slept, held his hand like I'd done when he was a baby. He died 3 weeks after diagnosis, barely had time to say his goodbyes. At the funeral, his children hugged me tight, thanked me for being there, for being steady. "We don't know what we'd do without you, Grandma," Sarah said, and I believed her. Patricia moved to Florida 6 months later to live near her sister. She sold the subdivision house, packed up, and left without much fanfare. The children were grown and scattered by then. Michael in the city, Sarah in the suburbs, Tommy in a small town about an hour away. They visited less after James died. There were always reasons: work was busy, the kids had soccer, the car needed repairs. I understood, or tried to. Grief makes people pull inward, I told myself. They'd come around when they were ready. Then one day last month Michael called. His voice had that careful, formal tone he uses for business. He said they'd been going through their father's papers and found his will, and there needed to be an official reading. I was confused. James had the house in the subdivision, which Patricia had already sold, and I assumed whatever small amounts he had went to his wife and children as was proper. Michael explained that the lawyer needed all family present, including me, and could I come to town on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Something in his voice made my stomach tighten, but I said of course I'd be there. I wore my good navy dress, the one I keep for funerals and important occasions. I drove my old sedan carefully into town, parked on the street by Mr. Henderson's office. The building was the same one I'd been to decades before, but now it had new carpet and a young receptionist who looked at me like I was someone's confused grandmother who'd wandered in by mistake. She checked her computer and said yes, I was expected, third door on the right. They were all already there when I walked in. Michael in his suit, looking like a lawyer himself. Sarah in her scrubs, must have come straight from the hospital. Tommy in his work clothes, his hands clean but his boots still dusty. Patricia wasn't there. She'd sent her regrets from Florida, Michael explained. The new Mr. Henderson, younger than me by 20 years but graying at the temples, sat behind the big desk and gestured for me to take a seat. I sat in the leather chair and folded my hands and felt suddenly terribly small. Mr. Henderson opened a folder and began to read in that flat, official way lawyers have. James's will was simple enough. Personal effects divided among his children, a small life insurance policy split 3 ways, some instructions about his burial that had already been carried out. I waited, wondering why I needed to be there for this. Then Mr. Henderson said there was a matter of the family property that needed to be discussed, and that's when Michael stood up. That's when he cleared his throat and looked straight at me and said those words that I'll hear in my head until the day I die. The family agrees. Grandma's getting nothing from the inheritance. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there in that leather chair with my hands still folded in my lap, and it was like I was watching the whole scene from somewhere far away, like I was floating up near the ceiling looking down at this old woman in a navy dress who'd just been told she was worth nothing. Michael kept talking, his voice getting more confident now that he'd gotten the hard part out. He was saying something about how the proper line of inheritance should flow through blood descendants, how it wasn't personal but just a matter of legal fairness, how I'd lived a good long life and surely I understood that family assets needed to stay in the family, the real family he meant, though he didn't say it quite that way. Sarah was nodding along, not meeting my eyes. She had her hands clasped on the table in front of her, and I noticed she was wearing the silver bracelet I'd given her for her 16th birthday, the one I'd saved up 3 months to buy. Tommy was staring at his boots, his jaw working like he was chewing on something tough. For a moment I thought maybe he'd speak up. Maybe he'd remember those 2 years in my house when I made him soup and sat up with him through the shaking and the nightmares and told him over and over that he was going to be okay. But he didn't say a word. None of them did. Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. He was shuffling papers, glancing between Michael and me, and I could see him trying to figure out how to navigate what was clearly a family matter that had spilled into his office. Michael turned to him and said something about needing to clarify the ownership of the family property, the house and land, before they could properly settle their father's estate. He said they'd been under the impression it was family property held in trust, that their grandmother, me, was just living there as a caretaker of sorts. That's when something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just this creeping understanding of how they saw me, how they'd always seen me. Not as the owner of my own home, not as the woman who'd built a life on that land, but as a placeholder. A warm body keeping the house standing until the real heirs could claim it. I wondered how long they'd been thinking this way. Had they discussed it at James's funeral, whispering in corners while I served coffee and cake? Had they talked about it over family dinners I wasn't invited to, dividing up assets I didn't even know they thought belonged to them? Michael pulled out a piece of paper from his briefcase, something he'd printed off the internet about inheritance laws and property rights. He started reading from it, his finger tracing the lines, something about intestate succession and surviving siblings. I watched his mouth move, but the words were getting fuzzy, mixing together into a sound like bees buzzing. My head felt light. The roses on Mr. Henderson's desk, someone must have brought them in fresh that morning, smelled too sweet, almost rotting. I focused on breathing, on keeping my spine straight, on not letting them see how their words were landing in me like stones dropping into deep water. Mr. Henderson finally held up his hand. He said with careful politeness that before they went any further with this discussion, he needed to review the actual property records. Michael looked annoyed, like this was a formality wasting his time, but he sat back down. Sarah shifted in her seat. Tommy kept staring at his boots. The lawyer pulled out another folder. This one thicker, and I recognized it. It was the folder from when Mama and Papa died, the one I'd brought to the senior Mr. Henderson all those years ago, and that had been updated and filed and stored in this very office ever since. I felt something stirring in me then. something warm pushing against the cold. Not quite hope, but maybe the memory of it. I thought about Papa sitting in the kitchen 2 years before he died, the light slanting through the window, telling me he'd updated his will. He'd said he wanted to make sure I was taken care of, that I'd never have to depend on anyone's charity. He'd said I'd earned this place 1,000 times over. I'd cried then, told him it wasn't necessary, but he'd patted my hand with his rough, work-worn fingers and said, "Baby girl, it's necessary to me." Mr. Henderson was reading through the documents, his eyes moving fast. Then he looked up at me and there was something in his face. Was it relief? He asked me very gently if I had my copy of the deed. I said I did, at home in the safe box under my bed. He nodded and said that wouldn't be necessary, he had everything here. Then he turned to Michael and his siblings, and his voice changed, became more formal, more firm. But I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sit in that room another minute listening to my brother's children argue about whether I deserved the home I'd lived in for 73 years. Something in me just broke loose and I stood up. Everyone looked at me, surprised, like they'd forgotten I could move, that I was a person who could make decisions about my own body. I said very quietly, "Excuse me," and I walked out. I heard Mr. Henderson call after me, his voice concerned, but I kept walking. Through the reception area where the young woman looked up startled from her computer. Out the heavy wooden door. Down the steps to the sidewalk where the afternoon sun was too bright and the air was too thick. I made it to my car before the shaking started. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, but I couldn't turn the key. My hands were trembling too badly. I thought about Michael's face when he stood up to speak, so confident, so certain of his rightness. I thought about Sarah's nodding, that agreeable bobbing of her head like she was in church listening to a sermon. I thought about Tommy's silence, which somehow hurt worst of all because I'd believed, that he understood what it meant to be cast out, to need someone to stand up for you. Memories kept flooding in, unbidden and sharp. Sarah at 6 years old, running through my kitchen with her hair flying, chasing a butterfly. Michael at 8, crying because his father had yelled at him for spilling juice, and me holding him and telling him everybody makes mistakes. Tommy at 15, angry at the world, and me letting him be angry, letting him slam doors and stomp around because sometimes people need space to feel what they're feeling. I'd loved them so completely, so fully, with every bit of maternal instinct I had in me. And they'd loved me back, I'd thought. They called me grandma, hugged me tight, told me I was the best. But love, I was learning, can be conditional in ways you don't see until the conditions change. They'd loved me when I was useful. When I was the free babysitter, the emergency contact, the one who showed up with casseroles and check-in calls. They'd loved me when I asked for nothing, expected nothing, just gave and gave and gave like a well that never ran dry. But now they were grown, established, busy with their own lives, and suddenly what I'd given didn't count anymore. Suddenly I was just an old woman in the way of their inheritance, their future, their plans. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the sun shifted and the shadow from the building crept across my windshield. Long enough that my hands stopped shaking quite so badly. I started the car finally and drove home on autopilot, my body knowing the way even though my mind was somewhere else entirely. The house looked the same as always when I pulled up the gravel drive. The roses were blooming by the porch, pink and red and white. The oak tree Papa planted the year I was born spread its branches over the roof. The porch swing moved slightly in the breeze. Everything exactly as I'd left it that morning when I'd locked the door and driven away thinking I was just going to a simple legal formality. I sat in the car in my own driveway and looked at my home, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger to it. Like maybe I didn't belong here after all. Like maybe Michael was right and I'd just been fooling myself all these years, thinking this place was mine, thinking I'd earned the right to call it home. I went inside and made myself a cup of tea because that's what you do when your world is falling apart. You put the kettle on, you measure out the leaves, you wait for the water to boil. Normal things. Safe things. Things that remind you that you're still here, still breathing, still capable of taking care of yourself even when everyone else has decided you can't. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed 3 generations of this family, and I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The phone rang at 6:30. I looked at it there on the wall, the old rotary phone I'd never bothered to replace because it still worked just fine, and I let it ring. 8 times it rang before it stopped. Then it started again 2 minutes later. I knew it was probably Mr. Henderson, maybe one of the children, and I couldn't bear to hear any voice right then. I needed the silence. I needed to be alone with this thing that was growing inside me. Not anger yet, but something harder and colder. Something like the first frost that settles on the ground in October and kills everything tender. The third time it rang, I unplugged it from the wall. The quiet that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the living room, the old grandfather clock that had been Papa's pride and joy. I realized I couldn't remember the last time this house had been this silent. There'd always been something. Children laughing, music playing, the television on for company. But now there was just me and the ticking and the sound of my own breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed, the same bed I'd slept in since I was a girl, and watched the shadows move across the ceiling as car lights passed on the distant road. I thought about everything and nothing. I thought about the difference between being alone and being lonely, and how I'd managed the first for so many years without feeling the second, but now they seemed to be the same thing. I thought about Michael's confident voice saying I had no claim. I thought about Sarah's nodding head. I thought about Tommy's silence most of all. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and went to the closet where I keep my important papers. The deed was there in a manila envelope, exactly where it had always been. I took it out and spread it on the bed and read it by the lamplight. There was my name clear as day. Sole owner, purchased by my parents and transferred to me upon their deaths. No joint ownership with James. No contingencies or conditions. Just my name, making official what Papa had told me that day in the kitchen. But there was something else in the envelope I'd forgotten about. A letter, written in Papa's shaky handwriting from near the end. He must have put it with the deed, and I'd filed it away and never read it again after the day he died. I opened it now, and his words came back to me across the years like he was sitting right there beside me. He'd written that he knew this might cause trouble someday. He knew James would feel it was unfair, that James's children might not understand. But he said he and Mama had thought long and hard about it, prayed over it, talked about it in the quiet hours of the evening when they thought I couldn't hear. They'd decided the house should go to me because I was the one who'd stayed, who'd given up my own dreams to care for them, who'd loved this land the way they did. He wrote that James had made his choice to build a different life, and that was fine and good. Papa was proud of him. But this house, this piece of earth, this was mine by right of sacrifice and love, not just by blood. At the bottom, in letters Papa had pressed hard enough to make indentations on the other side of the paper, he'd written, "Don't you ever let anybody make you feel like you don't deserve this. You earned it 1,000 times over." I folded the letter and put it back, and something in me started to shift. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to clarity. I'd spent the last 12 hours feeling like maybe I'd been wrong, maybe I'd been selfish, maybe I'd somehow stolen something that belonged to James's children. But Papa's words reminded me of the truth. This was mine. Not because I'd taken it, but because it had been given to me by the people who'd built it with their own hands and filled it with their own love. Morning came eventually the way it always does. I got up, made coffee, went through the motions. I kept the phone unplugged because I wasn't ready yet to hear what anyone had to say. Around 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. I looked through the window and saw Mr. Henderson's car in the driveway, and my stomach tightened. I thought about not answering, but he'd seen me looking, and besides, I couldn't hide forever. This was my house. Nobody was going to make me hide in my own house. I opened the door and he stood there looking apologetic and tired. His suit a little rumpled like maybe he hadn't slept well either. He asked if he could come in, and I stepped aside to let him pass. We sat in the living room, him on the sofa and me in Papa's old chair, and for a minute neither of us said anything. The morning light was coming through Mama's lace curtains, making patterns on the worn rug, and I focused on those patterns while I waited for him to speak. He started by apologizing. He said he should have reviewed the documents before the meeting, should have known what was coming, should have prevented the whole ugly scene. I told him it wasn't his fault. He couldn't have known what Michael was planning to say. But Mr. Henderson shook his head and said that wasn't entirely true. Michael had called him 2 days before the meeting, had asked pointed questions about the house, about property transfer laws, about whether there were ways to contest old deeds. Mr. Henderson had told him everything was ironclad legally, but apparently Michael had decided to try a different approach. Public pressure, family loyalty, emotional manipulation. Then Mr. Henderson told me what had happened after I left, and the whole picture suddenly came into painful focus. He'd explained to Michael and his siblings the actual legal situation. He'd pulled out the deed, the will, the transfer documents that had been filed 30 years ago when Mama and Papa died. He'd shown them my name as sole owner, showed them the paperwork that made everything official and binding. Michael had gotten red in the face, had raised his voice, had insisted this couldn't be right. He'd said his father had always told them the house was family property, that it would come to them eventually, that I was just living there as the eldest child but that it belonged to all of James's line. Mr. Henderson had been gentle but firm. He'd explained that no, the house had never been James's. It had gone directly from my parents to me, with no joint ownership, no shared title, nothing that would give James or his children any legal claim. And then he'd shown them something that made my heart ache even now as he described it. Papers from 30 years ago with James's signature on them, acknowledging the transfer, confirming that he understood the property was solely mine, stating that he had no objection to our parents' wishes. James had known. All these years he'd known the truth. Sarah had started crying when she saw those papers. Mr. Henderson said she'd covered her face with her hands and her whole body had shaken with sobs. Tommy had stood up without a word and walked out, his face like stone. But Michael had kept arguing. He'd said that even if the legality was clear, there was a moral question here. He'd said that surely I understood family came first, that blood was thicker than water, that the right thing to do would be to share this property with James's descendants, the ones who carried on the family name. I felt my hands curl into fists in my lap as Mr. Henderson told me this. The family name. Like I wasn't family because I'd never married, never had children. Like my 60 years in this house didn't count because my love hadn't produced offspring. Like sacrifice and service and showing up day after day after day meant nothing compared to DNA. Mr. Henderson had told Michael quite firmly that the meeting was over, that there was no estate matter to settle regarding this property, that this wasn't up for negotiation or moral debate. But before Michael left, he turned back and said something that Mr. Henderson thought I should know about. He'd said I'd better think very carefully about my choices. He'd said that family was everything, and when you're old and sick and dying, money and property don't mean much. It's the people around your bed that matter. He'd said I was choosing to be alone, and I'd have to live with that decision. The threat was clear even if the words were dressed up pretty. Choose them, choose to give them what they wanted or be cut off completely. No more visits, no more calls, no more family. They were drawing a line and daring me to cross it. Mr. Henderson asked me what I wanted to do. He said legally there was nothing required. The property was secure, the title was clear, I didn't need to take any action unless I wanted to. But he suggested very gently that I might want to think about making my own will explicit about what would happen to the property after I passed, just to avoid any future confusion or contest. I sat there in Papa's chair with the morning light making patterns on the floor, and I thought about Michael's face when he stood up in that office. I thought about Sarah's agreeable nodding, about Tommy's silence. I thought about how they'd loved me when I was useful and discarded me the moment I became an obstacle. I thought about James telling them lies for years, building up their expectations with promises that weren't his to make. I thought about every diaper I'd changed, every tear I'd wiped, every birthday cake I'd baked, every sick night I'd sat up, every dollar I'd scraped together to help them when they needed it. And I made my decision. I told Mr. Henderson I wanted to make a new will right away. I wanted it stated clearly, with no room for interpretation or challenge, that upon my death this house and property would go to the church and the public library in equal shares. They could sell it, use it for community programs, do whatever they thought best served the town. But it would never go to Michael or Sarah or Tommy. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. He asked if I was sure if I wanted to take some time to think about it. I told him I'd been thinking about it all night, and I'd never been more sure of anything. This house was mine. My parents gave it to me because I'd earned it. And I'd be damned if I let 3 people who'd turned their backs on me the moment it was convenient walk away with it after I was gone. He said he'd draw up the papers and have them ready for me to sign by the end of the week. After he left, I plugged the phone back in. It rang almost immediately. It was Tommy. I picked up the phone and Tommy's voice came through. Rough and uncertain, like he'd been crying or maybe yelling or maybe both. He said my name, just Grandma, nothing else, and then there was silence. I waited. I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just wait. Just let the other person sit with whatever they need to say until they find the courage or the words or both. Finally, he said he was sorry. He said he should have spoken up in the lawyer's office, should have told Michael he was out of line, should have defended me. He said he'd been shocked, hadn't known what Michael was planning to say, had frozen up like a coward. He said he'd been awake all night thinking about it, about me, about everything I'd done for him. His voice cracked when he said he owed me his life, that when he'd been at his lowest I'd taken him in without judgment, and now when I'd needed someone, anyone, to stand up for me, he just sat there like a stone. I listened to all of this and felt nothing. That's what surprised me most. Not anger, not forgiveness, just this flat, empty feeling like I was listening to a stranger tell me a story about people I used to know. When he finished, I asked him one question. I asked him why, if he felt so bad about it, he hadn't said anything yesterday. Why had he waited until after Mr. Henderson showed them the papers, after it became clear they weren't getting the house anyway? Why wait until there was nothing left to gain? Tommy went quiet. Then he said something that might have been honest or might have been another manipulation. I couldn't tell anymore. And I realized that was the saddest part of all this. I'd lost the ability to trust my own judgment about these people I'd loved so completely. He said he'd wanted to speak up in the moment, but Michael was the oldest, had always been the leader, and Tommy had fallen back into that old family dynamic where Michael decided things and everyone else went along. He said it was a reason, not an excuse, and he knew the difference. I told him I appreciated the call, but I needed time to think. He asked if he could come see me talk in person, but I said no. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I needed to figure out who I was now without them, without the role I'd been playing for 73 years. Then I hung up before he could say anything else, before the tears in his voice could work their way into the cracks in my armor. The phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was Sarah. Her voice was thick with crying, all stuffed up and shaky. She said she'd made a terrible mistake, that she hadn't understood what was happening, that Michael had told her and Tommy they were just going to discuss the family assets and make sure everything was fair. She said she'd trusted Michael to handle it properly, that she'd been tired from working a double shift at the hospital, that she hadn't really been paying attention until Michael stood up and started talking. She said when she realized what he was saying it was too late, and she'd been too shocked to interrupt. I let her talk herself out, let her pile up all her excuses and explanations like sandbags against a flood. When she finally stopped, I asked her the same thing I'd asked Tommy. Why hadn't she called yesterday, right after the meeting? Why wait until now? Sarah's answer was different from Tommy's. She said Michael had told them both not to contact me, that he was going to handle it, that he'd talk to me privately and work something out. She said she'd argued with him, said she wanted to call me herself, but Michael had insisted this was the best way. He'd said I was upset and needed time to cool down, and that if they all started calling it would just make things worse. So she'd waited and waited, and finally this morning she couldn't stand it anymore and called anyway. I asked her if she'd really thought I was being unreasonable, if she'd really believed, sitting there in that office, that I didn't deserve to keep my own home. There was a long pause, and then Sarah said something that hurt worse than anything else that had happened. She said she hadn't thought about whether I deserved it or not. She just thought about what would happen to the house after I was gone, and whether it was fair for it to go to nobody, to just be lost to the family. She said she'd been thinking about her own children, my great-grandchildren, and what kind of legacy they'd have. Legacy. That word sat in my chest like a stone. I'd given them my whole life as a legacy, and they wanted bricks and mortar too. I told Sarah I needed to go, and she started crying harder, begging me not to shut her out, saying she loved me, saying she was sorry. I told her I believed she was sorry now that she knew there was nothing to inherit anyway. Then I hung up. Michael didn't call. That told me everything I needed to know about Michael. Over the next few days, I started to hear things through the small-town grapevine. My friend Dorothy from the quilting circle came by with a casserole. She always brought food when she thought someone was hurting, and she told me what people were saying. Apparently Michael had been talking, trying to drum up support for his position, painting me as a selfish old woman who was hoarding family property and shutting out her own grandchildren. He'd been careful about it, making it sound like he was just concerned about fairness and family unity, but the message was clear enough. What Michael didn't count on was that small towns have long memories. Dorothy told me that when he'd talked to the church ladies, they'd reminded him about the year I'd organized the fundraiser that saved the church roof. When he'd talked to folks at the diner, they'd mentioned how I'd brought meals to half the town when they were sick or grieving. When he tried to get sympathy at the hardware store, old Mr. Patterson had apparently told him flat out that I'd earned that house 10 times over, and if James's kids had expected an inheritance, they should have been better to me while they had the chance. The town was taking my side, and I hadn't even told my side of the story. That meant something. It meant people had been watching all these years, had seen the truth of how things were even when I hadn't wanted to admit it to myself. They'd seen me showing up alone to church functions while James's family made excuses. They'd seen me buying school supplies for the kids, paying for their field trips, slipping them money when they needed it. They'd seen the whole shape of it, and they'd drawn their own conclusions. Sarah came by the house 3 days after the lawyer's office disaster. I saw her car pull up and thought about not answering the door, but something in me needed to hear what she'd say face to face, where she couldn't hide behind a phone line. She stood on my porch, the porch her grandfather built, that I'd painted and maintained for 60 years, and she looked small and tired and older than her 48 years. She asked if she could come in. I stepped aside and let her, but I didn't offer her tea or coffee or any of the hospitality I'd always automatically extended. We sat in the living room and she cried some more, said all the same things she'd said on the phone. But then she said something new. She said Michael had lied to them, had told them I'd agreed to discuss dividing the property, that I'd said I wanted to be fair to James's memory. She said if she'd known he was planning to ambush me like that, she never would have gone along with it. I asked her if that was true and she swore it was. I wanted to believe her. Some part of me that still remembered rocking her as a baby wanted desperately to believe her. But another part of me, the part that had hardened over the past few days, wondered if this was just another version of the same manipulation. If she was trying a different approach now that Michael's had failed. I told her about the will I was making, about leaving everything to the church and library. Her face went pale and she started to protest, started to say that wasn't fair to her children, to the great-grandchildren I'd never even mentioned wanting to protect. I stopped her right there. I said those great-grandchildren saw me maybe twice a year, on Christmas and Easter if I was lucky, and I'd stopped receiving thank you notes for birthday gifts 3 years ago. I said I'd offered to babysit dozens of times and been told they had it handled, they had daycare, they didn't need help from an old woman who didn't understand modern parenting. Sarah said that wasn't her fault, that her husband made those decisions about the kids, but even as she said it I could see her realizing how hollow it sounded. She was 48 years old. Her children were her responsibility. If she'd wanted me in their lives, she could have made it happen. She left after that, and I watched her car disappear down the driveway. I wondered if I'd see her again. Part of me hoped I would, hoped she'd prove me wrong, show me that her love wasn't conditional on inheritance. But I wasn't holding my breath. Tommy came by the next day. Unlike Sarah, he didn't cry or make excuses. He sat at my kitchen table and said he understood if I never forgave him, that he'd earned that. He said he'd been thinking a lot about those 2 years he lived with me, about how I'd never once thrown his failures in his face, never made him feel small or broken. He said the least he could have done was show me the same grace, the same fierce loyalty, and he'd failed at the first test. Then he asked me what he could do to make it right. Not to get back in the will. He was clear about that, said he understood that ship had sailed and deserved to sink. But what could he do to make amends, to prove that his apology wasn't just words? I thought about that. I thought about what I needed, what would actually help, what would show me he meant what he said. And I told him the truth. I said I didn't know if there was anything he could do, because trust, once broken, doesn't just glue back together. But if he really wanted to try, he could start by living his life in a way that honored what I'd taught him. Be kind. Show up for people. Don't measure love by what you stand to gain. Be the man I'd believed he could be when I took him in at his lowest. Tommy nodded and said he'd try. Then he left, and I sat alone in my kitchen and wondered if any of them understood what they'd really lost. It wasn't the house or the land or the money. It was me. It was having someone who loved them unconditionally, who showed up, who remembered. And once that's gone, no inheritance in the world can replace it. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet and somehow lighter than I expected. I signed the new will in Mr. Henderson's office, my hand steady on the paper, and when I walked out I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but a kind of settling, like a house that's been straining against its foundation finally finding solid ground. I'd made my choice. I'd drawn my boundary, and for the first time in maybe my entire life I'd chosen myself. The first thing I did was start saying no. Dorothy called and asked if I could make 3 dozen cookies for the church bake sale, the way I always did, and I said I'd make 1 dozen. Just 1. She was quiet for a moment, surprised. But then she said that was just fine, that was plenty. When the library asked if I'd volunteer for the summer reading program like I had for the past 15 years, running the craft table every Tuesday and Thursday, I said I'd do 1 Thursday a month. When Sarah's daughter, my great-granddaughter Emma, had a school fundraiser and Sarah called to ask if I'd buy some wrapping paper, I said no thank you, I had enough wrapping paper. Sarah's voice got tight and she said it was for Emma's school, like that was supposed to make me feel guilty. I said I understood that and I hoped Emma sold a lot, but I wasn't interested. Then I hung up before she could push. Each no felt like a small revolution. I'd spent 73 years being the person everyone could count on, the one who always said yes, who always had time, who always squeezed herself smaller to make room for everyone else's needs. And it had cost me everything in the end. They'd taken and taken and taken, and when there was nothing left to take but the ground I stood on, they'd reached for that too. I started doing things just for myself. Small things at first. I bought a novel at the bookstore, one of those thick paperbacks with a shirtless man on the cover that I'd always been too embarrassed to read, and I sat on the porch and read it cover to cover over 3 days. It was silly and romantic and completely improbable, and I loved every word. I planted a flower bed just for me, right outside my bedroom window, with flowers I liked even though they didn't match the rest of the garden. I bought myself a soft blue sweater that was more expensive than I'd normally spend, and I wore it even though there was no occasion, no special event, just because it felt good against my skin. I started taking walks in the evening, down the long driveway and along the road that curved past the old Miller property. I hadn't walked just for the pleasure of it in years. There'd always been somewhere to go, something to do, someone who needed me. But now I walked slowly, noticing things. The way the light came through the oak trees. The sound of the creek running high from spring rain. The fact that my body at 73 still worked pretty well when I gave it the chance. One evening I ran into Margaret Chun, whose brother David had courted me so persistently 50 years ago. She was walking her little terrier, and we stopped to chat. She asked how I was doing, and I could tell from her tone that she'd heard about what happened with James's children. Small towns don't keep secrets long. I told her I was doing surprisingly well, actually. Better than I'd been in years. She studied my face for a moment and then smiled and said she could see it, that I looked lighter somehow. We walked together for a while, talking about nothing important, her garden, my new flower bed, the state of the roads. When we parted ways, she said I should come by for tea sometime, and I said I'd like that. And I meant it. Tommy kept his word about trying to make amends, though I'm not sure he fully understood what that meant. He started showing up every Sunday afternoon, not asking to come in, just checking on things. He fixed the gutter that had come loose during a storm. He replaced some rotted boards on the porch steps. He brought groceries once, said he'd been at the store anyway, and thought I might need some things. I thanked him but told him I was perfectly capable of doing my own shopping. He nodded and didn't argue, just said he'd wanted to do something useful. I appreciated the gestures, but I kept my distance. I was cordial but not warm. I didn't invite him in for coffee or ask about his life or offer the easy forgiveness I could see he was hoping for. Some things I was learning don't heal on anyone's timeline but your own. And I wasn't ready yet. Maybe I never would be. That was okay too. Sarah called less often as the weeks went by. When she did call, the conversations were awkward and stilted, full of long pauses and careful words. She stopped asking me to babysit or help with things. I think she finally understood that the old dynamic was gone, that she couldn't rely on me to be available for whatever she needed whenever she needed it. I felt a little sad about that, but mostly I felt free. Michael never called at all. I heard through Dorothy that he'd been complaining around town about how I'd turned his siblings against him, how I was being vindictive and unreasonable. The fact that he still saw himself as the victim in all this told me everything I needed to know. Some people never learn, never grow, never look in the mirror long enough to see their own faults. I stopped wondering if he'd apologize. I accepted that he wouldn't, and I let that acceptance wash over me like cool water on a hot day. I started spending more time with my church friends, the women I'd quilted with and prayed with for decades, but had always kept at a slight distance. I'd been so focused on James's family that I'd never let anyone else get too close, never wanted to burden them with my loneliness or my needs. But now I accepted invitations I would have declined before. I went to Dorothy's house for lunch and met her daughter who was visiting from California. I joined Margaret and two other women for a trip to the antique mall in the next county over. We laughed and talked and picked through old treasures, and I bought myself a green glass vase for no reason except that it caught the light beautifully. One of the women, Betty, told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She said she'd watched me give and give to James's children for years, and she'd always wondered when I'd realized they were taking advantage. I was startled by that, by the idea that other people had seen what I'd been too close to notice. Betty patted my hand and said sometimes we need to lose something to understand what we've been carrying. I thought about that for days afterward, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone. The house began to feel different too. Lighter, less weighted down by expectation and old ghosts. I rearranged the living room furniture just because I wanted to, moving Papa's chair to a spot where it caught the morning sun. I took down some of the old photographs that had hung on the walls for decades, the ones of James and his family at various holidays and celebrations, and I replaced them with pictures I'd kept in a drawer. Me and Mama in the garden, Papa building the porch, me as a young woman standing by the old oak tree with a book in my hands. I'd forgotten that girl existed, the one with her whole life ahead of her. Looking at her now, I felt a kind of tenderness for all the things she'd given up, and all the things she'd gained too. I started keeping a journal, something I hadn't done since I was in my 20s. I wrote about my days, my thoughts, my feelings. I wrote about the anger that still flared up sometimes when I least expected it, hot and bitter. I wrote about the grief of losing people who were still alive, who I could still see around town but who felt like strangers now. I wrote about the unexpected joy of having time that was truly my own, mornings where I could sit with my coffee as long as I wanted, evenings where I could read or nap, or do absolutely nothing without feeling guilty about it. One day I wrote, I spent my whole life being what everyone needed me to be. I was the dutiful daughter, the devoted sister, the doting grandmother. I was the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who held everything together. But I was never just me. And now, for the first time, I get to figure out who that is. The library held a ceremony 6 weeks after I signed the will. They were dedicating a new reading room, and they asked me to cut the ribbon. I almost said no out of habit. I didn't like being the center of attention, didn't want to make a fuss. But then I thought about how the library had been my refuge all these years, how books had given me worlds to escape into when my own world felt too small. So I said yes. The reading room was beautiful, full of light and comfortable chairs and shelves lined with new books. The librarian, a young woman named Amanda, gave a speech about the importance of literacy and community and lifelong learning. Then she thanked me for my years of service and my commitment to making sure the library would continue serving the town long after we were all gone. People applauded, and I felt my cheeks warm with the attention, but I also felt proud. This mattered. This would last. This was a legacy worth leaving. As I cut the ribbon, I saw Tommy standing in the back of the small crowd. He was smiling, genuine and warm, and when our eyes met, he nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. He understood maybe what I was building here, what I was choosing. Sarah wasn't there. Neither was Michael. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd expected their absence. But it still hurt a little, a dull ache in my chest like an old bruise. I wondered if it would always hurt, if there would always be this small sad place inside me that missed who they used to be, or who I thought they were. Probably. Love doesn't just shut off like a faucet even when it should. That night I sat on my porch in the gathering darkness and listened to the crickets sing. The air smelled like honeysuckle and approaching rain. My new blue sweater was soft around my shoulders. Inside, the house waited for me, familiar and mine, every corner of it earned. I thought about everything that had happened, everything I'd lost and everything I'd found. I thought about the girl in the photograph, young and hopeful, and the old woman I'd become, scarred but still standing. And I realized something that made tears spring to my eyes, but good tears this time, not bitter ones. I realized I was happy, not the desperate, clutching happiness that comes from other people's approval, or from being needed, but a quiet, steady happiness that came from knowing myself, from honoring myself, from finally being enough just as I was. I'm 74 now. A full year past that day in the lawyer's office when everything changed. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did, if I wish I'd handled things differently, if I miss James's children. The answer is complicated, the way all honest answers about family tend to be. Yes, I miss them. I miss the children they were, the babies I rocked and the toddlers I chased and the teenagers I worried over. But those people are gone, replaced by adults who made choices that showed me exactly where I stood in their priorities. And no, I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret choosing my own worth over their expectations. Tommy still comes by most Sundays. We've fallen into an easy rhythm that isn't quite what we had before, but is something new and maybe more honest. He does small repairs around the house and I make him lunch and we talk about surface things, mostly his work, the weather, town gossip. Sometimes we dig deeper. Last month he told me he'd started going to therapy, really working on himself, and he thanked me for showing him what it looked like to set boundaries. He said watching me stand up for myself had made him realize how often he'd let people walk over him too, how he'd been so afraid of conflict that he'd sacrificed his own integrity. I told him I was proud of him for doing the work. And I meant it. We don't talk about that day in the lawyer's office anymore. We've said what needed to be said, and now we're building something different. It's smaller than what we had, more careful, but it's real. Some relationships can't go back to what they were, but maybe they can become something else if both people are willing to try. I'm still deciding if I'm willing. Some days I am. Some days I'm not. Tommy seems to understand that and he doesn't push. Sarah and I talk maybe once a month now, brief phone calls where she updates me on her children and I listen politely. She stopped asking me for favors or help after the first few times I said no. She stopped expecting me to be at every family event or milestone. At first her voice was hurt when she called, wounded and confused, like she couldn't understand why I wouldn't just forgive and forget. But over time her tone changed. She became more respectful, more cautious. She started asking if I had time to talk rather than just launching into her news. Small shifts, but they mattered. She invited me to Emma's high school graduation last spring. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. Part of me wanted to refuse out of principle, to show her that she couldn't just summon me when it was convenient. But another part of me remembered that Emma was just a child, that she hadn't been part of what happened in that lawyer's office, that punishing her for her mother's and uncle's mistakes wasn't who I wanted to be. So I went. I sat in the back of the auditorium and watched Emma walk across the stage in her cap and gown. She'd grown into a lovely young woman, tall and confident, with Sarah's smile and her father's steady eyes. After the ceremony, Sarah brought her over to say hello. Emma hugged me and thanked me for coming, said it meant a lot to her. I asked her what she planned to do next, and she told me about the nursing program she'd been accepted to, how she wanted to help people the way her mother did. I gave her a card with a check inside. Not a large one, but enough to buy textbooks or help with expenses. She teared up and hugged me again. Sarah watched this exchange with something like pain in her eyes. Later, as I was leaving, she caught up with me in the parking lot. She said she was sorry again, and that she knew saying it over and over didn't change anything. She said she understood now what she'd lost, what they'd all lost. She said she hoped someday I might be able to trust her again, but that she'd earned the distance between us and she'd respect whatever I needed. I told her I appreciated that. I told her I was glad to see Emma doing well, and that I hoped she'd stay in touch as she went through nursing school. Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. Then I got in my car and drove home, and I cried a little on the way because grief is strange that way. It can ambush you even when you think you've made peace with things. Michael I haven't seen or spoken to since that day. I hear about him occasionally through the town grapevine. He moved to another city about 6 months after everything happened, took a job at a bigger firm. Some people say it was because of the gossip, because too many people in town knew what he'd done and sided against him. Some people say he was planning the move anyway and the timing was coincidental. I don't know which is true and I've stopped caring. He made his choice. He chose pride over family, entitlement over love, and he has to live with that. I hope someday he learns something from it, but I'm not holding my breath. His wife Jennifer called me once about 8 months ago. She said Michael didn't know she was calling, that she was doing it on her own. She said she was sorry for what had happened, that she'd told Michael at the time he was wrong but he hadn't listened. She said she hoped I was doing well. I thanked her for calling and told her I appreciated her kindness. I didn't ask about Michael, and she didn't offer information. It was a brief conversation, cordial and careful. After we hung up, I felt a strange sort of sadness. Not for Michael, but for Jennifer, who seemed to be trying to clean up a mess she hadn't made. The house has become fully mine in a way it never was before. I've made changes, small and large. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow that makes the morning light even brighter. I replaced the living room curtains with something more modern, fabric that lets in more light. I turned James's old room, the one Tommy had stayed in during his recovery, into a sewing room for myself, with a new machine and good lighting and shelves for fabric and thread. I'd always sewn for other people, made clothes and quilts for everyone else. Now I make things for myself, or for the sheer joy of creating something beautiful. My friend Margaret and I have grown close this past year. We have tea every Tuesday afternoon, alternating between her house and mine. We talk about everything, our pasts, our regrets, our small daily joys. She told me once that her brother David had never quite gotten over me, that he'd married later in life and always wondered what might have been. I told her I'd wondered too sometimes what my life might have looked like if I'd made different choices. But I was learning that wondering about what-ifs was less important than making peace with what is. The quilting circle has become more central to my life than it ever was before. We're making a special quilt for the library, a community project where each woman contributes a square representing something meaningful about the town. My square shows the old oak tree in my yard, the one Papa planted, with a book resting against its trunk. When I showed it to the other women, Dorothy got tears in her eyes and said it was perfect. We work on the quilt every Thursday, our needles moving in and out, our conversations weaving together like the fabric itself. I volunteer at the library more now too, but on my own terms. One Thursday a month like I'd committed to, plus occasional special events when I feel like it. Amanda, the young librarian, has become a friend. She's 32, getting her master's degree online, full of ideas and energy. She reminds me of who I might have been if I'd had the chance to pursue my own education, my own dreams. I mentor her in small ways and she teaches me things too about technology, about new trends in library services, about seeing possibilities instead of limitations. The church used part of my expected bequest to start a scholarship fund for local kids who want to pursue higher education. They announced it last Christmas, said it would be called the Anderson Family Scholarship in honor of my parents. When Reverend Mitchell told me about it, I felt something warm bloom in my chest. This was legacy. This was meaning. This would help children I'd never meet, would open doors for futures I'd never see. It mattered more than any amount of money or property passed down through bloodlines. Last week I had a visitor I didn't expect. A young woman, maybe 25, knocked on my door and introduced herself as a writer working on a project about family dynamics and inheritance. She said she'd heard my story through someone at the library, and she wondered if I'd be willing to talk to her about what happened. My first instinct was to say no, to protect my privacy, to keep the whole painful mess locked away where it belonged. But then I thought about all the years I'd spent staying quiet, keeping peace, not making waves. I thought about how that silence had allowed people to treat me poorly because I never called them on it. I thought about other women out there, women like me who'd spent their lives giving and giving, who might be facing similar betrayals from the people they loved. So I invited her in, made her tea, and told her my story. I told her everything from start to finish. The raising of James's children, the years of sacrifice, that horrible day in the lawyer's office, the aftermath, the slow, painful process of learning to choose myself. She listened carefully, took notes, asked thoughtful questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said my story wasn't really about inheritance or property, or even family betrayal. It was about a woman learning at 73 that her worth wasn't determined by how much she could give to other people. After she left, I sat on the porch and thought about that. All my life I'd measured my value by my usefulness. I was a good daughter because I took care of my parents. I was a good sister because I helped James. I was a good grandmother because I raised his children. But I'd never asked myself the simple question. Was I good just because I existed? Just because I was me? The answer I'm learning is yes. I don't have to earn my worth through service or sacrifice. I don't have to justify my existence by how much I give away. I'm enough just as I am. The roses are blooming by the porch right now, pink and red and white, just like they've bloomed every summer for as long as I can remember. Mama planted them when she was a young bride, and I've tended them all these years, and they keep coming back, keep pushing through the earth, keep opening their faces to the sun. There's something hopeful in that, something that speaks to resilience and beauty, and the stubborn refusal to give up. I'm 74 years old. I've lived through heartbreak and betrayal. I've lost people I loved and mourned relationships that died while everyone was still breathing. But I'm still here. Still in this house that's mine by every right that matters. Still tending the garden, still reading books, still drinking my morning coffee while the sun comes up over the oak tree Papa planted. And I'm happy. Not the way I thought happiness would feel when I was young. Not the dramatic joy of romance novels, or the fulfilled contentment of being surrounded by adoring family. But a quieter happiness, deeper and more durable. The happiness of knowing myself. The happiness of honoring my own boundaries. The happiness of building a life that's truly mine. Sometimes in the evening, when the light slants golden across the porch and the crickets start their singing, I think about that day in the lawyer's office. I think about Michael standing up and saying those words that broke something fundamental inside me. And I realize now that what broke wasn't me. It was the illusion I'd been living under. The illusion that love and sacrifice were the same thing. The illusion that giving everything meant you were worth something. The illusion that family was forever, no matter how badly they treated you. What I built in place of that illusion is smaller but stronger. It's a life based on truth instead of obligation. It's relationships based on mutual respect instead of one-sided giving. It's a sense of self-worth that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or appreciation. And it's peace, finally, after 73 years of chasing it in all the wrong places. Blood may be thick, honey, but self-respect is thicker. And a goodwill, not just the legal kind but the kind that lives in your heart, can be thicker still. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it. And if there's an old woman out there reading this or hearing this, someone who's given and given until there's nothing left, someone who's wondering if it's too late to start choosing herself, let me tell you something. It's never too late. Not at 70, not at 80, not at 90. It's never too late to look at your life and say, this is mine. I earned it. And I'm not giving it away to people who don't value what they've already been given. The house will go to the church and the library when I'm gone. It'll become something useful. Something that serves the community I've loved all these years. And when I close my eyes for the last time, I'll do it knowing I stood up for myself. I'll do it knowing I mattered. Not because of what I gave, but because of who I was. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.